Good morning and welcome to this event, the third and final of this week, which replaces the 5th annual conference for environment by the PLA, which is normally held at the Museum of Docklands. I'm Tanya Ferry, I'm the Head of Environment for the PLA and I'm your chair for today. A few notes of administration. You're listening in on mute and we will have a number of presentations where the panel will then join us, and if you can write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, we will ask the panels as members as we go. This is a recorded event, so if you missed any of the other events in the series, you can go back and have a look at those in due course. Just like the previous years, we're going to cover a number of actions and activities and the fantastic work that stakeholders and the PLA has been doing along the river, despite 2020. At the beginning of last year, we focused on what net zero might look like in 2050 for the river. And these sessions this year have been split to reflect that, to sustainability, innovation and change, and habitats, in a response to the climate and ecological challenges that we face on the Thames in the southeast today. So today we are focusing our impact on activities on habitats and species in the Thames, both positive and negative, and exploring some of the ongoing research to manage and help to improve the river even further. The habitats on the river are really fundamentally important for birds, fish, and even bees. And in many places, these estuary habitats are protected. They also give us space to enjoy our recreational activities, to convey our goods, and even capture carbon. But they are suffering as a result of climate change and human impacts, in particular, coastal squeeze, where the flood defence and the water levels prevent habitats being created and maintaining important feeding areas for birds and for fish. Elsewhere in migratory species that visit the Thames during their life cycles, they're also being affected. So the habitats on the river need to be crucial in their migrations. In certain parts of London, these habitats have disappeared and we now have a narrow channel. In these areas, it's really challenging to create a viable habitat, but it's so important to do so. Fish use the river for nursery and breeding to protect their young from predators. And places like Richmond and Putney, we have smelt spawning, or in Tilbury and Gravesend, we have Dover sole, also really important for our food. These fish use the power of the tide and they need an opportunity to stop and rest. Artificial habitats are critical in creating gaps where our walls have stopped this happening. Where possible, the PLA works with the Environment Agency and other stakeholders to try and improve those gaps, try and put areas of habitat in terracing and spaces for amenity for local people in developments along the river. In lockdown, we actually saw more people coming to the river to enjoy the space and the clean open air. But that has, as we've heard from other stakeholders, another consequence. There's more people on the banks, which creates disturbance for animals like seals, and there's more litter on the banks adjacent to the river. The PLA in the past has worked with other rescue organisations to ensure that people know about the best practice and increase awareness of when an animal might actually be in distress. It isn't nowadays unusual to see seals all the way up to Richmond. We've also partnered with Thames Estuary Partnerships and the Environment Agency to refresh some guidance on how to create artificial habitat in the right way, so that it can grow and provide the habitat that the animals need. We now host that guidance on our website, Estuary Edges. In terms of litter, we are continuing to work with our passive driftwood collector network to remove over 200 tonnes of litter a year, and helping and supporting cleanups across the river. We've launched the Cleaning the Thames website to encourage people to get involved and tell us, even if they just pick up those 3 items on their daily exercise. We also manage dredging and construction on the river, which means we're able to influence how it's done. And we have set mitigation measures for dredging to reduce the pollution that might occur. We've been working with other regulators like CFAS and the Environment Agency to improve the way that we can align our regulation without any impact on recreation, navigational safety, and on the environment. We recognise that the river must grow, and the habitat is a key part in that. And our use of the river will continue alongside those animals and habitats. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, who is Alex Mcgorran, who's a NERC PhD student with the Natural History Museum and Royal Holloway University of London, who's been researching for a number of years now microplastics and its impact on the tidal Thames. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to talk to you today about evaluating microplastic contamination in the Thames food web, which is what my PhD is focused on. So unfortunately, we probably all know that plastic is a problem, both globally and locally. Plastic's a big issue in the ocean, as Blue Planet and other programs have highlighted, but it's in the air we breathe, it's in the soil, it's even made it to the top of Mount Everest. And it doesn't stop there, it's in the Thames as well. This is a study that was published a few years ago, by my supervisors, Dr. Paul Clark and Professor Dave Morritt. And this was testing different types of eel fishing equipment in the Thames. These are fyke nets. They're stationary on the riverbed and sit about knee height. And unfortunately, in just a couple of months, nearly 8,500 pieces of litter were collected. And this was the first time we truly started to quantify how much plastic was hidden below the water surface. In the work that I'm doing now, we're still finding large pieces of litter in the Thames. And this is just one example of a piece of plastic pulled from the river in 2019. And you can see the best before date here. It's the 9th of August, 86. This piece of plastic is actually older than I am. And it just goes to show, looking at as good as it does in such good condition, plastic is really long lasting in the environment, and it will have lots of opportunities to interact with wildlife. When we look at ingestion, we typically think of microplastic ingestion. And that is anything that is smaller than 5 millimeters. That's about the size of a lentil. On the right, you can see a picture of a piece of plastic in comparison to a piece of rice, just to show you how small this plastic can be. To put that into perspective, that's actually quite a large piece of microplastic. They can go down to nanoscale. Because of this small size, they're really easily ingested by a wide range of organisms. Even plankton can ingest these plastic pieces. They can be fragments, maybe a piece of that crisp packet that I just showed you, or can be pieces of microbeads that were produced to be that size. And in the Thames, we have a really rich ecosystem, lots of animals that call this river home. And we want to know how much plastic each of these animals are eating, and whether there's an interaction, whether there's this accumulation of plastic, as you can see in other pesticides, such as DDT, for instance, where birds of prey have a higher toxicity level than other species. Due to my master's, we luckily have some evidence for some of these groups. For instance, we know that about 7% of sampled shrimp have plastic in the stomach, and only ever a maximum of 1 fibre per individual. If we move up to the next step in the food chain to fish, we know that about 28% of fish have plastic in the digestive tract, and of the fish with plastic in the stomach, it's an average of about 3 fibres. We do also have evidence that this can fluctuate, so depending on what sort of the random sample you get, sometimes up to 75% of sampled fish have plastic in the digestive tract. For today, I'm going to focus on just one of these groups that we haven't talked about yet, and that's going to be the crabs in the Thames. And we sampled these at Erith, which is a place we know there is a lot of litter. And we did this with a commercial trawler getting special permission from the EA and PLA to fish. So this is the Boy Daniel, and you can see the nets on the back of this trawler. And we take 10 trawls per trip, 5 in the water column and 5 on the riverbed for 15 minutes at a time. And we do this every 3 months for 2 years to get a total of 8 trips. For the point of crabs, though, we're just going to focus on the first year of data and only on the bottom trawls. So we're looking at 2 species, and that's the native European shore crab and the invasive Chinese mitten crab. We have 94 shore crabs to look at and 41 mitten crabs. We got these back to the lab, and then I dissected out the tissues that we were interested in, and that's the gills, the gastric mill or stomach, and the gastrointestinal tract or intestines. Overall, we've got 870 pieces of plastic that we recovered from 135 crabs, and we find that almost every individual has plastic in at least one of those 3 tissues. So it's 70% of shore crabs and every individual of Chinese mitten crab that had this plastic in either the gills, stomach, or intestines. But where it gets really interesting is if we focus on just the stomach. Due to the unique structure of the stomach, tangles of plastic are forming. So knots of several pieces of plastic tightly woven together. And these items, these tangles, are treated as just one piece of plastic because of how difficult it is to untangle and accurately count how much is in them. So when I say there's 874 pieces of plastic, one of those pieces of plastic could be a tangle with over 100 pieces of plastic in it itself. So it really is an underestimate of how much these animals are ingesting. It's also interesting because we have a big difference between the 2 species. Knots are only present in 10% of shore crabs, whereas 95% of mitten crabs have these tangles. So one is more affected than the other. So this box plot sort of shows that a little bit more visually. So we've got the dark boxes, which are the mitten crabs, and the light boxes, which are the shore crab. And it splits up how much plastic is in each of the tissues that we looked at. So on the left down here, you can see the gills, and you can see not much plastic is present on the gills. So whilst we know that plastic is in the water column, by the fact that these 2 boxes on the side here, the intestines and stomach, are much larger, we know that ingestion is the main route of exposure for plastics. We can also see that Eriacaia has more plastic in it than Carcinus, and that also the gastric mill always accumulates more plastic, other than this one individual that had 50 pieces of plastic in the intestines. So most of this plastic is fibers, as you can see from some of these photos. And on the left here, this is the stomach. This is the actual stomach removed straight from the animal, and this is the plastic you can see in it. We've got a clear fiber and a white film. But why this individual is particularly interesting is if we look at that white film under the microscope, it's got this diamond or checked pattern on it, and that's indicative of sanitary pads, where all the layers of the pad are sort of heat sealed together. And you can see at the top here an example of one of the many, many sanitary pads I've had the pleasure of pulling from the Thames. So don't let anybody tell you science isn't glamorous. You too could be sorting through litter. So the main issue, though, is obviously these tangles of plastic. These plastic balls can fill the stomach and therefore could have a severe negative effect. And as I said, it's the specific structure of crab stomachs that is causing these tangles to form. To aid digestion, they have these teeth-like structures in the stomach called ossicles, and they grind and shred food. But introducing fibers to the stomach, that same motion causes a tangle of plastic. And you can see here how densely packed these fibers are and how they can start to catch other pieces of plastic, like here, a fragment of balloon. And we know that based on other items that we find in the net, which can show pieces of balloon. So the next slide is a bit graphic, so please look away for the next 15 seconds or so if you're not comfortable with seeing dead animals. This is a picture of an albatross, and we know that these are very iconic for the amount of plastic they eat and how they starve. But unfortunately, fortunately, we're not seeing this in crabs. We're not seeing dead individuals. So we expect that when they grow, they shed their exoskeleton, and this could be a mechanism of release for plastics so that it isn't a lethal effect for them. We know that most of the plastic we're finding is polypropylene, polyester, or nylon, and this can come from ropes or clothing. So it's coming from either recreational use of the Thames, but also from our households. And this graphic goes to show some of those sources. Obviously, there's littering and mismanaged waste, which can put the large items of plastic into the river. But it's up here in the left-hand corner that I'm focusing. Sewage-related debris, so wet wipes and sanitary pads flushed down the toilet, and fiber release from washing machines, where up to 700,000 fibers can be released per wash. Even if 99% of these are collected by a wastewater treatment plant, with the number of people in the Thames catchment, that fiber release is still very significant, and it's likely the main source for plastic in the Thames, or also at least the fibers that these animals are ingesting. So I'm going to end it there for now. I'd like to thank everybody that's helped me with this work, whether it be with sample collection or support, or just there to have a good chat and work things out with. I'd also like to thank everybody for listening. And then when it comes time to answer questions, I'll happily answer any. And if we don't get to any, please feel free to email or contact me on Twitter.
Thank you very much, Alex. Some really shocking numbers there, and a number of animals in terms of percentage, high density of animals affected. But it's promising that they may not be effective for their longevity of their lives. But really interesting. I suspect there's lots of questions, but please do make sure you put them in the Q&A for Alex, so we get to ask some of those. I can see that the numbers are starting to pop up. So that's great. Thank you very much, Alex. Next, I'd like to introduce Izzy Donovan. Izzy has been working on Kent and Essex reserves for the RSPB after she completed a study of the rewilded site at Knepp Estate. She's the site manager for the RSPB and in Essex. Over to you, Izzy.
So I'm going to talk about, I'm the senior site manager for the RSPB in South Essex, and I'm going to talk to you today about coastal grazing marsh and some habitat improvement works that we were lucky to conduct due to some funding that we received from the PLA. So what is a grazing marsh? So coastal grazing marsh is defined as seasonally wet, low-lying areas that promote low-growing vegetation. In the Greater Thames, many of these areas have been reclaimed from the estuary or from the coast and often lie behind sea walls. So why are they important? They provide valuable habitats for indigenous plants such as the lapwing and the redshank, overwintering waders and wildfowl that come here in the winter migratory to feed up, such as teal, shoveler, widgeon, and black-tailed godwits. Mammals such as the water vole that you can see here, and rare invertebrates such as southern migrant hawker, dragonfly, scarce emerald damselfly, and the shrill carder bee, which is one of the rarest species of bee in the UK. So these habitats are under threat and have been significantly declining for the last nearly 100 years. And the greatest loss of coastal grazing marsh has been in the Greater Thames has been in Essex. So in 1930, 24,000 hectares of coastal grazing marsh were identified. By 1960, 50% of this coastal grazing marsh had been lost. And by the 1980s, only 28% of this habitat still remained. There's quite a few different reasons why this happened. So between 1935 and 1989, nearly 1,600 hectares of this grazing marsh was converted into arable production. Other reasons for the loss of this has been mismanagement, so installation of field drains, increased use of fertilizers by farmers and pesticides, overgrazing, so intensive farming practices causing compacted soils, also encroachment of the built environment, so increase in urban areas around the river and the coast, called coastal squeeze, and climate change, so wetter winters and hotter, drier summers, which leads to lack of surface water and a lower quality of habitat. So these are the reserves that I manage for the RSPB in South Essex, from Stamford Wharf in the west to West Camberley Marsh in the east. You can clearly see that the reserves are surrounded on 3 sides by the built environment, and on the 4th side they're surrounded by the Thames. So that's a really good example of where habitats are coming under the pressure of coastal squeeze. So of the 750 hectares of land that we manage in South Essex for the RSPB, approximately 60 to 70% of this is grazing marsh, as you can see here, and that's about 400 hectares. So what makes a grazing marsh, and what are we trying to achieve in these areas? So we tend to manage grazing marsh for breeding waders such as lapwing and redshank. So you hear me talk a lot about that in the next few minutes. These 2 species act as great indicators for the health of grazing marsh. So we know if we're providing good conditions for these birds, we're also providing good conditions for the invertebrates, the plants, the mammals, the fish, and the amphibians that also use the grazing marsh. There are 3 main principles for managing grazing marsh. Firstly, to have the correct sward, and we do this by using livestock. So we use cattle for the most part and some sheep in the winter. And cattle are excellent at creating a low level of vegetation with some tusky swards. And this is really, really preferred by the nesting birds like lapwing and redshank, as it gives them a 360-degree view to look for predators. It also helps them feed on wet edges and muddy corners of ditches and rills. That's really good for when they have chicks. The second thing we need on a marsh is water. So we like high levels of water over winter. That's also really good for those overwintering migratory species. And coming into spring, we like that water to draw down and become lower to provide, again, those muddy edges for foraging for birds and other species. The third thing for us is to have a lack of ground predators such as foxes. So these really predate on the lapwing and the redshank eggs and nests and chicks. And obviously being in such a built environment on 3 sides, we have a high number of these in the local area. So about 18 months ago, we started doing some projects with the PLA, and we're very lucky to receive some funding to help improve the marshes. And the majority of the projects were carried out on the coastal grazing marsh. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of a couple of the projects that we carried out on Bowers Marsh here. So these were the 4 projects that we carried out. We installed a water pipe, we did some ditch improvement, we installed a new tilting weir, and we installed a predator exclusion fence around the marsh. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of those 4 projects. So firstly, the water pipe. This helped bring water. This is the main river ditch that we get water to the site from. And we install a pipe through this bund here, and it comes out the other side and into the grazing marsh. And this is a far more direct route for the water to come into the marsh, so it wets up quicker, and we have that wet habitat that those species really, really favour. The second project that we did was to carry out 1.7 kilometres of ditching at Bowers. Ditching helps improve the water flow around the marsh and creates those muddy edges that the lapwing and the redshank really, really need for feeding and foraging, and especially for their chicks. So the third project that we carried out was to replace a broken and leaky tilting weir. So in our ever-changing climate, we're all very aware that the climate is changing, and in a particularly wet part of the country in Essex, holding on to every drop of water is vital. Every drop counts. So to manage the site, to keep the water level stable, to enable that drawdown through the spring and summer to provide feeding and foraging habitats, we need to be able to control these water levels. If there are heavy rains in the spring and there's a chance of nests being flooded out, we need to be able to move that water off the site quite quickly. So this is a picture here of when the tilting weir was installed in late summer. You can see the low water level down the channel, and hopefully this is going to work. This is a video of the water at the end of January, where it's just been raining pretty much every single day. You can see the water flowing over the top of the tilting weir, and that will flow over until it reaches our desired level where the weir is raised, and that provides stable conditions across the marshes. So our last and our biggest project that we carried out was to install a predator exclusion fence around the central grazing marsh here, which is 25 hectares, and around this freshwater lagoon. So the grazing marsh, it looked really good, the habitat was in good condition, the sward was at the right level, but we'd never ever seen any breeding birds nesting in this area, nothing. And we set up some trail cameras and we found that there's a large population of foxes roaming over this area. We'd also seen foxes where we have not had such wet winters, coming onto this lagoon and swimming out to the islands and decimating up to 50 pairs of upset nests in a weekend. So we decided we would like to fence around both of these. So we installed a fence. It's 3.4 kilometers long and takes into account these two areas. So this is what it looks like. In places it can look quite impactful. It's 2 meters high. It has a 45-degree overhang, and this prevents ground predators from climbing up and over it. It's also dug into the ground by 30 centimeters. So this prevents anything from trying to dig under it. We're obviously very aware of the visual impact of this on the site. So we tried to put it through areas where there's low visual impact. And this is an example of where you can see the fence, but this is our viewing point for the site to see over the lagoons. And I think you'll agree that there's not a huge amount of impact to see the birds that are out there. So we do know that the fence is working. This picture was taken from the inside of the fence looking outwards a couple of days ago. We have trail cameras that monitor the weak points, which tend to be the gates, and the foxes on the outside of the gate, thank goodness, and the trail cameras on the inside. And we do know that there are some foxes in the area, but they are all luckily on the outside of the fence. So some results. This is what the grazing marsh looked like in April 2020. We were very unfortunate, obviously, with coronavirus that we weren't able to carry out any specific breeding bird surveys last year, but through some ad hoc monitoring, these are some of the results that we got. In the grazing marsh, where we'd never had anything breed before, we had 6 pairs of redshank and we had 6 pairs of lapwing. The other 7 pairs of lapwing were on the islands. And we counted later, once the restrictions had lifted, the chicks of the redshank and the lapwing. So we know that breeding was successful in this area. So if this was April 2020, if you note the barn here, and note the barn here, this is January 2021 after our heavy rainfall. So you can see the site looks a lot wetter after a very heavy winter rainfall. This has started to draw down now and will create those muddy edges that the lapwing and redshank really look for. But we also monitor birds over winter, and we finished our last survey on Monday. So I've only got preliminary data of peak counts, but you can see compared to the winter of 1920, this year we've seen significant increases in those 3 key overwintering species. We really look forward to carrying out some more specific surveys this year, and really look forward to seeing the data from that. I would just like to say thank you to the PLA for funding the fantastic work on our site, and hopefully get some more results soon. So yeah, thank you. And any questions I'm happy to take at the end.
Thank you, Izzy. Really interesting. It's really great to see the impact that the work's making, and we certainly enjoyed coming out on some of the sites to get rid of some of the other scrub and things in the early part of late part of last year, 2019. So thank you. As Izzy says, there's questions. If you've got questions, please pop them in the chat. There's certainly some really interesting, even on ad hoc basis, that the results are showing quite positive outcomes. So it's really, really worthwhile work that's been done. So great, thank you. And similarly, in terms of management, we're going to move to Kate Forten, who is a campaign manager for Green Blue, which is an RYA and British Marine partnership. She's an environmental scientist that used to be a geography teacher. I didn't know that about you, Kate. So it's fact from me. And she joined the Green Blue in 2014. So she merged her sailing passions with that of protection of the environment. And she's going to talk about some of the measures that they're working on now. Thank you, Kate.
Hi, thank you, Tanya, and thank you very much for inviting me along to talk today. So I'm Kate and I'm the campaign manager for the Green Blue, and I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to the Green Blue first of all, because some of you may not be familiar with it, and then I'm going to go into a little bit around some of the work we're doing. So in terms of what I'm going to be covering, after I've done an introduction to the Green Blue, I'm going to talk about some of the environmental issues that we focus on. And like I said, we're going to focus on an example campaign that we're working on, which is the Life Recreation Remedies Project, which is specifically around seabed habitats and protecting them from any pressures from recreational activities. And then finally, I'm going to share with you some of the resources that we have available for you as a boating community, if any of you out there are associated with that. So first of all, who is the Green Blue? So what we aim to do is inspire sustainable recreational boating across the entire UK. And we focus not just on coastal waters, but also inland waters as well. The way we do this is we try and raise awareness of what the key environmental issues are associated with recreational boating. And then we develop guidance and resources to help individual boaters, clubs, centres, marine businesses to minimise any impacts they may be having on the environment. We also do a lot of outreach work, so talks, webinars such as this. We also go to a lot of boating related events and have stands, and we also do educational activities as well. We also work very closely with the government on certain projects, and we work together to determine what the guidance is for recreational boating. So we do have strong relationships there. And the Life Recreation Remedies Project, which I'm going to be talking about, is linked with Natural England. So that's just an example of our kind of partnerships and working together. And then in terms of developing additional projects, we work with organisations, charities that have similar aims to us to have a further reach and impact amongst the boating community. We also try and promote more sustainable products and services. So any that are related to the marine sector, we try and communicate those out to the individual boaters so they're aware of what those are, such as electric outboard engines, more eco-friendly cleaning products, for example. And then finally, we try and identify what marinas, harbours, and boatyards have in terms of environmental facilities that boat users can use. So that might be recycling, pump out stations for sewage disposal, or it might be hazardous waste disposal or filtered boat washdown areas to collect anti-foul residue or invasive species. And on our website, we have a lot of that information. And towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you some of those resources. So in terms of the Green Blue, we have our own website. We are a joint environmental programme between the Royal Yachting Association and British Marine. So we do have our own separate website, but do go and visit, because this is where you can find all the advice and information on how to make your boating community more sustainable. And this is where you'll find all the resources as well that I will go through at the end. And there's also information on the Remedies Project. So some of the key environmental issues we focus on, so there's quite a few that the Green Blue looks at, but we are obviously working with the Royal Yachting Association and British Marine on the kind of sustainability strategies and environmental pathways that they're putting forward to make the entire sort of marine sector more sustainable. So we're looking at the kind of top priority areas such as climate change, we've got energy use there, engine efficiency, the source of our energy. We also look around waste, so we've just heard about plastic pollution, and what we tend to do there is we welcome partnering up with other organisations that are very much focused on plastic pollution campaigning and seeing how we can work together to get the boating community more involved. Again, we look at wildlife and habitat protection, which is what we're kind of focusing on today. And we also look at water pollution. But essentially, all of the elements that you can see here come back and impact on our wildlife and our habitats, either directly or indirectly. But what I'm going to be focusing on is obviously the habitat side of it. On our website, we have boating around wildlife advice, anchoring with care, and invasive species specifically. So the project or specific campaign that we're working on at the moment is the Remedies Project, and it's an EU Life funded project. It's a 4-year project, and we're now in the 2nd year of that. And as you can see on the bottom of the slide here, we have various partners involved in that, ranging across the board to deliver. So what does Remedies stand for? So it's quite a long word. And actually, we've come up with a sort of more memorable one, which is Save Our Seabed. So that's the kind of more comms communication name for it. But behind the scenes, it's reducing and mitigating erosion and disturbance impacts affecting the seabed. It's called the Recreation Remedies Project because there are numbers of threats to seabed habitats, including climate change, nutrients overloading that's coming off the land. But we're particularly focusing on recreational user groups, hence why the RWA and the Green Blue involved from the boating perspective. But also it is looking at other recreational activities such as bait digging and dog walking that can also impact on these habitats. So the partners involved, it's Natural England who are leading on this, and we have the Royal Yachting Association, and of course the Green Blue is the environmental awareness programme for the Royal Yachting Association, so that's where we're involved. We also have the Ocean Conservation Trust, who are linked to the National Marine Aquarium down in Plymouth. We have the Marine Conservation Society also involved, Plymouth City Council, and Thames Estuaries and Consultative Forum. As part of that, the EU LIFE programme is funding it, and they fund 60%, and then the partners sort of match fund, if you like, with time and resource to deliver. So the project is focusing on 5 key special areas of conservation in the south of England, where in particular seagrass and merle beds are located. Why these 5 sites? They are currently assessed as in unfavourable condition for that particular type of habitat. And of course, the project is focusing on recreational activity, and this is where most pressures are happening. There are other areas around the UK that do have seagrass areas. Some of them are also in unfavourable, but in terms of the project, we have to focus on some of the most vulnerable areas in a limited area. But anything created out of this project, we want a legacy, and any of the materials will in effect help the wider stakeholders, no matter where you are, in terms of protecting seabed habitats. So what's the project aiming to do? It's demonstrating habitat restoration and management techniques, including seagrass restoration. So the National Aquarium is growing seagrass in its labs, and then they're aiming to reseed this seagrass in these 5 locations. So they've already got plans coming up shortly to start doing the first initial planting of those seagrass down in Plymouth. In terms of management techniques, we are looking at advanced mooring systems, so eco-friendly moorings that boaters can use to help minimise the impact on the seabed compared to traditional ones. And I'm going to show you a diagram later on of what those different ones look like. And we're also looking at sort of access management from the shore to minimise any trampling on these seagrass habitats, for example, because they do exist in shallow waters. We're doing raising awareness to inspire care of the habitats by key users, and that's where the Green Blue is involved. We're developing guidance and raising awareness amongst the boating community of the importance of these habitats, but also what the boating community can do to help minimise any impacts through our activities. And then finally, the project is monitoring this. So it's an ongoing project, learning from what we're doing, finding out about these advanced mooring systems, how effective they are, So we have better understanding of how to restore these habitats and how to protect them going forwards, and essentially having sort of legacy across Europe for that. So why are these seagrass habitats in particular so important? Well, 1 metre of seagrass produces 10 litres of oxygen. So it's kind of actually got the nickname of the lungs of the ocean, if you like, or the rainforests of the sea, because it is an amazing habitat to be able to produce this kind of level of oxygen in such a small area. Additionally, it stores a lot of carbon, so 10 to 15% of the world's carbon stores are in seagrass, although it only covers probably 0.1 to 0.2% of the world's seabed. So for a small amount of area, it can store a lot of carbon, which of course is going to help us with the climate change threat. So we really want to be looking at restoring these sites across the UK and across the world. So they also fix nitrogen through their roots, through the ribosomes there, and it takes nitrates out of the water. So it actually helps a little bit with pollution there, fixes them into nitrates for nutrients for other species, aquatic species to use, as well as the plant itself. It also protects from coastal erosion. Again, we're having increases of that with climate change, but it enables to trap the sediment around the root systems of the seagrass, and the actual seagrass itself takes out some of that energy from the water. So it's really important that we start looking at this natural sort of protection of our coastlines. And then finally, it creates a nursery ground for some of our top fish species that we eat. So pollock, herring, plaice. So you can see there in the picture, hidden away, you can see a plaice camouflaging there. So it's such an important area for these species of fish to develop from their juvenile state into adult, when they can then go out into the open water. So although the project isn't focusing directly in the Thames area, the nearest is obviously the Essex Estuary that we're looking at, but it doesn't mean to say that there aren't seagrass areas around Thames. So here's the Thames Estuary, and you can see some of the locations where some of those exist. And I'd like to thank Molly from PLA for providing this map, because she has a lot of information and details around the kind of ecology of the site. So we've got Two Tree Island, All Hallows on Sea, Southend, and Falmouth Island. So you can see in the sort of light turquoise areas there dotted around. So any of the information we're producing from the project can be used by boaters, no matter where they are along the coastline, to protect them. So what have we produced? Okay. What have we produced for boaters? So we've got the Anchoring and Moorings Guide, and this can be downloaded directly from the Green Blue website, and it shows how you anchor to protect the seabed, but it also introduces advanced mooring systems. This is just to give you an example of some of the examples. So our traditional one for moorings is a chain along the bottom, and of course that causes abrasion. So the more advanced mooring systems are lifting that chain off the seabed, as you can see by the two other diagrams here, to minimize any scouring or abrasion. So some of these are being installed across the 5 sites and trialed and tested. So it's really exciting, because it means that boaters can continue to access these areas whilst minimizing the impact, which is very important. And just some upcoming webinars that you might be interested in if you're interested in this topic. So on the 25th of March, we've got our Advanced Mooring Systems webinar. And then in April, we have a seagrass and anchoring best practice webinars. We're going into far more detail. To find out how to register for those, you can follow the EU Life Remedies on social media and the Green Blue, or visit the Green Blue website, where we have a Join Our Webinars webpage. So you can find all the information there. I'm going to leave it at that for time, but do go on the website and explore all of our resources for boat users, clubs, centres and marine businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's really interesting and really useful resources to help recreational boaters minimise their impact on the environment they love to be in and to enjoy. So really, really good. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions as well in the Q&A for you later. Speaking, as you mentioned, Molly, Molly is up next. Molly Tucker is our technical advisor for ecology. She joined the PLA to undertake an impact assessment on the protected sites and the effect of growth from the Thames Vision. And she has stayed with us ever since. And she is going to present some exciting work that we're going to be doing later on in the year. Over to you, Molly.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that introduction, Tanya. So as Tanya mentioned, I'm Molly Tucker. I'm the technical advisor for ecology at the PLA, which means I basically work with anything that's to do with animals and habitats. So the topic that I'm going to be talking about today is part of our salt marsh restoration works at the West Doric Laguna Marshes SSSI. So to start off with, we're going to be talking a little bit about what the site actually is and where it's based. So the site is based in Grays, Essex, and for context, in this map here, this is the QE2 bridge and the Dartford Tunnel, which everyone in Essex and Kent is very fond of. And the site is designated as a SSS site back in November of 1991. The SSS site is split into two specific units. So we have the landward unit, which is a PFE lagoon, and the unit that we're particularly interested in is the intertidal unit, which covers the mudflats and also the salt marsh, which is in this particular habitat area here. So what's so special about this particular SSSI is the fact that this salt marsh here is actually the largest area of salt marsh we have within the inner Thames Estuary. And for this salt marsh in particular, it's known for its plant community. So the plant community it has is typical of the higher marsh. It's quite complex, and it's normally only found landward of the river wall. So this is one of the only sites on the Thames where it's actually found seaward of the river wall. So the salt marsh itself supports large numbers of overwintering bird populations, including dunlins and redshank. And in 2010, when Natural England surveyed the SSSI to see what the current condition was, it was determined to be in an unfavourable declining condition. And this is mostly by coastal squeeze. And I know you've had 3 definitions already, but I'm going to give you another one. So coastal squeeze happens when, in a natural environment, the salt marsh would be able to retreat with the increase in sea level rise. But when you put in the hard flood defences, which are along this coastal line here, it stops that habitat from retreating backwards, so you'll end up losing the range of habitat. So, like Tanya sort of mentioned, I undertook an internship back in 2017, which was looking at the impacts of the Thames Vision on our what was then 9 SSSI sites, which would now be 10. So this graph here shows sort of a summary of what was said or what was shown. The blue bars and the red bars show the site condition in the amount of the site that is in a favourable condition, blue site being before and red site being after Thames Vision. And these red squares show the impact score of the Thames Vision on that site. The research did show that every site would be positively impacted on by the Thames Vision. But as you can see from here, West Surrey is the only site that had none of the area within the PLA's jurisdiction as favourable before the Thames Vision, and it would also remain as unfavourable following the Thames Vision if there was no further intervention. So this kind of highlighted to us that there's something needed to be done further to what was just being done through the Thames Vision. So we wanted to focus on that site specifically, and we was in discussions with Natural England, who are the statutory conservation body, the Environment Agency, who also have statutory responsibilities, and the Land Trust, who own the landward side of the SSSI. When we really wanted to figure out the way that we could best improve this site. And as the main issue was erosion, that was what we wanted to focus on. And this map down here shows the amount of erosion that has occurred at this site. So this was taken from aerial photographs. The red areas here show differences in the aerial photography from 1990 when the site was designated to 2018 when the most recent photographs were taken. And it shows that there is a loss of about 4,000 meters squared of habitat since in about 30-year period. So we wanted to figure out a way that we could combat that erosion to help improve the site, but we also wanted to work with the natural process of the river. We didn't want it to be something that was forcing the river to change in such a drastic way. So you can see in this top image, this was taken from a site visit to West Thurrock in 2019. And you can see here where there's areas of mudflat which are already being colonised by salt marsh species. And again, up through the reel here. And that shows that there is already some accretion occurring at site, but we wanted to be able to quicken that, to make it go quicker and to help it be more resilient. So in 2020, we took out a invited tender to 3 organisations that work within sort of area of work, and we successfully contracted in Salix, who have done a number of projects to improve habitats on the Thames already, and they have done the design for us, and they will also be doing the construction for us as well. So what we aim to achieve, this here is provided to us by Salix as part of their design. As you can see, these areas here where we follow the boundary round are areas of salt marsh that we believe we could accrete, which totals up to about 6,160 meters squared. So this will take the site from its current levels of about 32,000 meters squared up to 38,000 meters squared, which sort of restores it back to its 1990 levels. And how are we planning to do that? So, as I've mentioned before, the site was already showing to be accreting in some way. We wanted to be able to encourage that to happen at a faster rate. So one way you can do that, naturally, as a river, we are quite fortunate in the Thames to have a very high sediment load in the river, which unfortunately does make a lot of people believe that the river is unclean, but it's actually just the mud within the river that's making it brown. So we do have a lot of sediment which is available for us to be able to improve the site naturally. So the proposal is to install these brushwood fascines, which are staked into the mudflat. I think this is about the 5.2 metre contour, which is about mean high water neaps. And what happens will be that as the site floods, so on the flood tide, the site will come in and this will all be covered in water. And then as it drains out, it will drain out back through the fascines, and it creates a loss in velocity here, which will allow sediment to drop out of the water column and deposit onto the riverbed, which will allow this area here from between the fascines up to the edge of the salt marsh to accrete to a level above mean high water neaps, which is required for the salt marsh vegetation to colonise. So it's very important to us as well that we don't cause any unintended consequences by doing this work. So as a result of that, all the materials that we source through the installation of these will be from a sustainable and UK managed woodland. And it's also important for us that we utilise the river, as is one of our goals for the Thames Vision. So any material being delivered will be delivered by multicat or another vessel and deposited straight directly to the site. But the river will also be used for construction. So we'll be using floating platforms to prevent any trampling of the existing salt marsh vegetation. So how do we make sure that this is working the way we want it to work? And we also want it to be a functioning ecosystem. So how can we monitor that as well? So as part of the works, we're going to be using a range of hydrographic surveying techniques. So this here is an example of one thing that you can do. This is a bathymetric survey. And basically what will happen is we will monitor the riverbed levels using these techniques, and we'll be monitoring how much the values are increasing. So how much sediment is being deposited on that site to be able to tell if it's working the way we want it to. But as I mentioned before, the salt marsh vegetation in the site is also very important. So we want to be able to monitor how it's colonising the newly accreted sediment, and also that the communities of that salt marsh aren't being negatively affected. So we will be undertaking salt marsh vegetation surveys, both pre-works and post-works, just to monitor how that happens and what's being affected. And we also want to monitor the overwintering birds who are using that site, and also the fish, as mentioned before, these sort of habitats form important fish nurseries and shelter from predation. So we want to be able to monitor how the fish are using the site beforehand and also how they're using it afterwards to make sure that the habitat is still functioning in the way we want it to. So a little bit about timelines. As part of the SSSI, there is not so much a restriction, but it's recommended to avoid the overwintering bird period, which is the 1st of October to the 31st of March. This is just to prevent any unnecessary disturbance. Another restriction we've had on this site was, so the SSSI borders this Once-Combe Marine Conservation Zone, which is designated for its populations of tentacled lagoon worm and its supporting habitat of intertidal mudflats. So it's suspected that the tentacled lagoon worm is breeding during the 1st of June to the 31st of July. So as a precaution, we have also scheduled the work to avoid that time to prevent any unintended consequences. So with that in mind, we will be hopefully, subject to consents being approved, be constructing this feature from the 1st of August to the 30th of September 2021. And as a current progress update, we have submitted now our applications to the MMO for a marine license and also to Natural England for their assents. And that's a very brief overview. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Molly. Sorry, I was having technical issues with buttons there. Thank you very much. Really interesting to see this sort of history of the site and how we're tackling that going forward. So hopefully lots of questions on that, and as some of the questions are around that sort of geography, hopefully that's answered some of them already. Please do continue to add questions in the Q&A box, and we'll put them to the panelists shortly. So finally, but by no means least, I'd like to introduce Robin Mortimer, our Chief Exec of the PLA, who has some summary comments and quite exciting announcement. I might have underwhelmed that. Robin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tanya. And it's good to be able to speak to everybody. Obviously, on these sessions, always sort of slightly odd compared to face because I'm sitting in a room and can't see any of you. So I hope you can all see and hear me okay. I just want to start really by saying a big thank you to all the speakers this morning and also on the other days. You know, these events only come to life with people who are prepared to give their time to talk about things they're passionate about and they know a great deal about. And I think we've heard this morning some really interesting presentations spoken with authority by people who know what they're talking about, and that's been hugely interesting. And I also really want to thank the PLA team in particular, and especially Tanya Ferry, who's pulled all this together and has put a huge amount of time, as you'd expect, into this series of webinars. Thank you very much, Tanya, for doing that, and I hope everybody listening, whether today or on the other days, has found them interesting. And finally, just a word actually to our technical support, Theo, who is sort of behind the scenes and making sure that it all goes smoothly and that we are audible and visible, etc. So with that in mind, I'm going to say, Theo, next slide, please. I'm just going to give a very short sort of recap of the last couple of days, particularly for those on this morning who couldn't make the first two webinars. And really very sort of headline level, so not a great deal of detail. But the first webinar focused on long-term sustainability, and in particular, our very excitement announcement last year that we as an organisation have set a net zero goal to be achieved before the UK goal of 2050. So we want to achieve net zero by 2040 at the latest. And what I was most pleased about in that announcement was that, unlike some organisations I've seen where all the action and activity sort of seems to come in 10 years' time, we're very much front loading our plans. So we think that we can at least halve our carbon or greenhouse gas emissions by 2025. In fact, just over 60% is on our projections. And the main way we can do that is by switching our fleet to sustainable biofuel. And as you'll see there from the little pie chart, as an organisation, the vast majority of the PLA carbon footprint is currently diesel on vessels. So that's the biggest thing we can have a go at, and we are going to do that by switching, and have already started that process this year. The other things which we can do are then to try and address those other segments of the of the pie chart, and that's installing renewable energy on our sites wherever possible, and looking at the same time at biodiversity net gain and projects which benefit both biodiversity and carbon, obviously through sort of sequestration and providing habitats which are beneficial. And we have said that offsetting is a last resort. We're not ruling it out for those, the final tiny proportion, but we want to see offsetting as absolutely the last resort and to avoid it if we possibly can. And just since we're obviously on biodiversity this morning, I would say, and I've been very passionate about this for a long time, having been involved in forestry about 15 years ago and seeing the big the mistakes which are made, frankly, in the 80s and 90s in forest plantations, that we don't go down that route again. And obviously, in the pursuit of net zero, that we make sure that we also continue to deliver for biodiversity, given in mind that we have both a crisis around climate change and also a crisis around extinction of species and erosion of habitat. So those twin goals are very much in our minds as we approach this. Thanks, Ian. And next one, please. The second summary slide on the first webinar, the sustainability webinar, is just to mention that we also last year launched what we call the Thames Green Scheme, which is us looking out beyond the PLA to the broader river and the operators on the River Thames. And we've been doing quite a lot of work with the Thames operators over the last 3 or 4 years, both on emissions which affect air quality and also on emissions which contribute to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. And so this scheme is an attempt to provide a common basis for measuring what companies are doing in order to address their emissions, and to encourage the early adoption of new technology, for example, or new fuels, and also to provide a basis on which customers can pick the greener transport options. Obviously, by having a sort of logo which reflects what companies are doing, it provides some information to the market in order to drive change. So it's a voluntary scheme, but there's been good take up in order to try and drive some of those wider changes across the river beyond the PLA. Thanks very much. So next one, please. The second webinar yesterday focused on the broad topic of innovation and change. And obviously a huge amount of what we're talking about in all of these sort of environmental improvements requires things to be done differently and organizations to change their culture, but also to adopt new technologies. And so we're really pleased to be able to support that directly with some potential financial investment. Obviously, a lot of the big money for innovation in the space of alternative fuels will come from the government in one form or another, but organizations like the PLA can play a part in that, particularly for, if you like, the sort of the bespoke adoption of new technologies in our own context. So we've launched a call for bids through the Knowledge Transfer Network Innovation Exchange for the first what we call flexible zero emission berth on the Thames. In other words, somewhere where if a ship is calling into port, it can do so in a way which, when it's alongside the berth, produces no emissions. Now, a lot of this kind of tends to focus on shore power, and that is certainly one option. But we know from other places and also our own studies that shore power can be extremely expensive because of the grid connection. So we're looking for innovative ideas around this. Other ports in the world, for example, have some floating solutions for zero emission berths. So we're open to all such options. And the idea is to accelerate the uptake of this sort of technology in the Port of London and in the Thames. And we're going to be looking at sort of more calls around the PLA Sustainable Innovation Fund going forward. This first one focuses on the zero emission berth, but there will be others to come. Next one, please. The second part of our innovation and change announcement, if you like, was a proposed tidal energy demonstration site to support future energy demand in London. Now, when I first joined the PLA in 2014, it was one of the first things I remember asking Tanya and Jim Trimmer about, sort of, God, we've got this, powerful river. I've been involved in the Severn Estuary tidal lagoon study. Why don't we have anything similar on the river? And of course, actually, it's quite complicated. Tidal technology is far from straightforward. The potential impacts on other objectives, such as biodiversity, can be quite complicated. And the technology is not as sort of straightforward as I once believed. So I am really pleased that we are now moving forward with a proposal to have a demonstration site, which we're making available for operators that think they've got potential solution to come forward with and to trial out something which might be beneficial for the future. So the Thames is a particularly sort of complex environment to do this. And therefore, it's why it's taken so much time, I think, to make this happen. Whereas in other sort of environments, there has been progress on this. But we're very pleased to be able to move this forward now with this demonstration site. So we look forward to receiving bids for that. Now that brings us on to today. So as we've heard, there are some really pressing challenges in terms of biodiversity and habitat impacts, and you can only sort of look at those the data around plastic ingestion in marine species to be pretty shocked and horrified, and to think we need to do something about this. It is obviously really great to see that where we do intervene, we can see some impacts. And I was delighted to see the numbers, the bird numbers that are on the RSPB restorations project put up on the screen. It's the first time I've seen those. So it does show that if you take some action and you put some money in, you can make good things happen. So with that in mind, we're launching today a new PLA Environment Fund, which is open for applications from today until 5 o'clock on the 28th of May this year. And this is for small projects, so small grants, if you like, up to £5,000, which should be achievable by the end of 2021. In other words, things that can be done straight away to make a difference to the objectives which we're setting. Now, you can find the application form on the PLA website. And there's also the opportunity to ask any questions of the team if you have got questions, if you're thinking about putting in a bid to the fund, and questions can go to that email address on the screen there. So that's envconsultation@pla.co.uk. But if you don't write that down quick enough, then it's all on the website anyway, so you'll be able to find details there. And next slide. This fund is basically to target two particular issues. So the first is invasive non-native species, and the second is litter in the Thames, including plastic litter, plastic pollution. So we're looking for proposals in either of those spaces, projects which can address those at a local level, and I think that's really exciting because there's a great place for sort of big strategies, and you need big strategies, whether it's sort of a 2040 strategy on net zero. But there's also a place for immediate practical action and being able to see things happening by putting some money into a useful project and being able to see the results on the ground. So this fund is very much in that latter category. It's about sort of practical action at a local level to make a difference on the Thames. And that was all I was going to cover. So there's our little slogan as we come out of the pandemic, hopefully: build the river back better. Lots of organisations are talking about building back better, but we do really mean it. We've all suffered economically through this pandemic recession, but there is an opportunity as we now go forward to make sure that we do so in a properly sustainable way, and that's very much the goal of the PLA. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Robin, and hopefully that's exciting and welcome news in terms of the fund for some of the stakeholders listening and potentially some of them on the panel. So if I could just invite the rest of the panel to turn their videos on so we can all see you. We've got a number of questions coming in. Just to acknowledge some of the questions that are there, there's some questions about Swanscombe, which we've seen and we'll answer separately. There's also some questions about air quality, which were covered in the previous events which are recorded, so please have a look at the information in those. So the first question is for Alex. So I mean, there's two questions that I'm going to combine together, Alex, for you. So one's around, well, they're both around change, actually, in terms of what's going on in the future, whether you've seen a shift in plastic around PPE and the sort of COVID context of plastic on the river, and what role the tideway tunnel. So there's a sort of solution and a problem question there in the sense of next steps.
So in terms of PPE, we did sampling in March, so just before or just as lockdown was kicking off. And then we took samples in July and September. In terms of the large pieces of plastic, we didn't find anything in that was definitively a mask or single-use gloves. There was a proportion of plastic that was sort of small blue films. So like just a sheet of plastic, like a tiny fragment. Obviously that could be single-use gloves, but there's nothing there to really tie it down to specifically being that. But I know that Thames 21, who do a lot of cleans on the foreshore, they are finding a lot of PPE, specifically single-use masks. So it is something that is there and it is an issue. It just wasn't picked up in our surveys. And then with the tideway tunnel, we are currently on an antiquated sewer system, and definitely sewage overflows are going to be one of the main routes for plastic to be put into the river. So having the tideway, whilst I can't say it will definitely solve the issue, it will certainly be a huge help. And we all know taking plastic out the river is very difficult. So it's certainly better to stop it getting there in the first place. So things like an improved sewer system are the methods by which to do it.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. Yes, every little helps, I guess, in terms of that, doesn't it? Izzy, it's actually a question I hadn't thought of in terms of management. You mentioned grazing marsh and using cattle. How do the cattle not squash the nesting species? How does that interaction work, and do you need to do any management to control it?
So we graze at very low levels. So our compartments are very large, and we only have a small number of cattle grazing at any one time. We only graze for a short period of time, so between mid-April to the end of November. So that is during the breeding season. But when the cows come out of being in the sheds over winter, they're often put onto an area that isn't so favourable for breeding birds. So something that might be locked up for a hay marsh in summer. So they usually get their kind of excited energy out in the hay marsh first, and then they go into the grazing marsh a lot calmer. With the extensiveness of the cattle numbers that we have, trampling is a very rare occurrence. It's more common to happen by sheep, and there's records of sheep more eating eggs than cattle trampling eggs. So that's why we only have sheep on in the autumn and the winter.
Great. Thank you very much. Very interesting sort of solution. I like the idea of excited cattle coming out, running out of shed and seeing grass for the first time in a year. Great. Thank you. A question from Molly now. I think, I'm not sure if there's, it says if the activity is above mean high water needs, how do the sediment laden water get into the right areas for the salt marsh?
So mean high water neaps is kind of the lower of the two high tides, and we go in a cycle between mean high water neaps and mean high water springs, which are higher. So for whenever the water column is above mean high water neaps, that area will flood, so it will be accessible by the river. It's only when we have particularly low high tides that it wouldn't be. So for the majority of the time, the water would be able to easily access the site.
Thank you. Hopefully that answers the question. If there's any more, please do put them in the Q&A to make sure. Then Kate, we've got a question for you. I know you're a national sort of project officer, but is there anything you see as specific benefits for the Thames in terms of the Remedies Project?
So yeah, I mean, the project is focused on the sort of 5 sites, but all the materials that we're developing for that, the guidance around anchoring, best practice, the trialling of the advanced mooring systems, we're hoping will better sort of inform other areas around the UK. In terms of individual boaters, they can download that guide and follow our guidance on how to anchor to minimise impacts. And then we're hoping all the research into the project will better inform other areas around the UK so they can start adopting them. So in terms of the advanced mooring systems, if we can trial those and show their measurability, the cost of them, effectiveness in protecting these habitats, then it will give confidence elsewhere to adopt those. And because it's an EU Life funded project, it's got that legacy of all the materials we're developing, they can be used across Europe essentially. So by going on the Greenview website and following the project, any boating community can pick up on that advice. It's just sort of focused work is very much in those 5 sites, but we are delivering these webinars which are open to anyone to register, so you can pick that information up wherever you are in the world, really.
Great, thank you very much. Right, sorry, I'm scrolling again. So just another one for Alex around compostable plastic. How's that? Are you finding that in the samples?
We have, it's obviously quite hard to tell whether it's compostable plastic unless it is labelled as such when you get it. You've got obviously not a complete item, usually it's a fragment. So a lot of it is a sort of detective work, we call it, where you're there looking up logos and trying to work out what specifically an item is. We have found compostable dog poo bags. So it isn't a solution necessarily. I'd say be very wary of compostable or biodegradable or bioplastics. The trouble is they're very new emerging solution and they don't actually solve the issue of the consumer market and the fact that they are still designed to be single use or disposable, and they do degrade at varied amounts of time in the environment and in some cases might still release microplastics. I know that several years ago, Plymouth did a study where they buried some plastic bags that were biodegradable and hung some off of a pier. And after 3 years, all of them could carry a load of shopping still. So for 3 years, it is essentially still a carrier bag. And whilst technology might have developed further, a lot of these also require they be disposed of in a certain way. So it might be that you've got a plant-based plastic that can only be recycled at one centre, which means it's not necessarily logistically suited to a mass rollout if you don't live near that recycling centre, for instance. So I definitely would say reducing the amount of plastic use and changing policy and the consumer market is maybe a better approach than just switching to these almost greenwashed alternatives.
Great, thank you, Alex. There's a couple of questions for Robin here. So just on the reductions that we will expect to see in terms of switching to HVO, not for carbon, but for NOx and PMs. And there's also a question about if we're aiming to get to reach net zero by 2040, how is that going to be translated into the river as a whole, which is something we discussed last year as well. Robin?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. I'll take the second one first. And I'll give you a moment just to, Tanya, see if you can remember the exact percentages of the NOx and PM10 reduction from our biofuel choice. But yeah, no, the broader question is a good one about what's our role in the wider river. Now, we don't, PLA doesn't directly regulate most of the vessels that call on the Thames. So the passenger boats are regulated by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, the MCA, and international vessels are regulated in the UK by the MCA, but internationally by the International Maritime Organization. So that is not a sort of cop out, because obviously we do have a role, but we don't directly have a regulatory function for the engine standards or emissions. What we can do is to work with the terminals in order on the river in order to provide alternatives to vessels calling, and that's why we're focusing on this idea of a zero emission berth, because we do know that many shipping companies are actively working themselves to reduce their own carbon footprints. As the sort of focus on maritime emissions grows ever stronger, it's been a sector which hasn't had so much focus as, say, the road transport. There's greater pressure to look for zero carbon solutions. So that's why we're focusing on the zero emission berthing option. The vessel standards and engines themselves, I'm afraid, are kind of governed by much broader sort of regulatory bodies than us, since we obviously cover just one locality. The general answer to the question, the very good question about the air quality benefits of biofuels, is that they are much better. And I seem to recall a figure of 90% for one of those reductions. But Tanya, do you happen to have that on in your mind or in your script sheet?
I think it does depend on the HVO, but the one we're choosing, it has up to, as Robin says, up to 90%, and we are publishing some comparatives on the basis of the tests that we did on our harbour vessel when we were trying to decide which fuel to use. So those will be published in due course and can be shared with the audience as well.
But the key point is they're better for the climate and they're better for local air quality. That's important.
Yeah, definitely, because they're from waste materials rather than new virgin materials. Brilliant. Right, back to chairship. Thank you. So I've got a couple of questions for Robin. Oh, well, it's probably from Molly actually, in terms of the solution in terms of litter. So is there anything in terms of the geographical spread, Molly, for the inns and litter? Is it just within the tidal Thames or beyond in the Thames River Basin? Can we just clarify that, please?
Yeah, so it is within the tidal Thames as opposed to the wider basin, so up to the mean high water spring mark and the PLA's jurisdiction. So should be from Richmond, I believe, up to the outer estuary. Great.
Thank you very much. Right, so as we're coming towards the end of the seminar, this is if those of you who've seen this before in the last 2 days, I ask a question of all panelists, same question. Just a quick sort of précis as people see either as an individual or as a company. And the question has come from Alistair Gale, so I'm not going to take any credit for this. This is Alistair's question for you all. So having heard the great work that you're doing around across the range of habitats, how optimistic are you that the habitat improvement to maintain itself, and what is the one key thing in addition you would like to see done? And we'll go in order of speaker. Sorry, Alex. So you will go first, but others you will have a little bit longer to think about that.
I would say I'm quite optimistic. I like to always focus on the positives, and I think there's definitely a lot of work being done to manage and restore habitats, both from pollution and all the other aspects that are affecting them. I think definitely one thing in terms of plastic is that at present a lot of pressure is put on the consumer, and it's always up to the person buying the product to choose whether you're going to use a sustainable alternative. And I think that isn't always a just system. It limits who can make those choices. So I'd like to see some more sort of policy changes affecting industry to help reduce the pressure it puts on individuals.
Thank you. Very good answer, Alex. Izzy?
So yeah, I'm also an optimistic person. I think you have to be in these kind of conservation roles. I think for our kind of coastal grazing marsh habitats, the biggest continued pressure is obviously coastal squeeze again, so increased built environment. Personally, I think the fact that Swanscombe was recently designated a triple SI, as some people have already said, is incredibly important for protecting those habitats in the estuary. One thing I think that people can do on the sites where we've currently got good habitats is just to be conscious of your own disturbance to those environments and to use them in a sensitive and careful way, so you're aware of what like wildlife is using those sites as well. It's just not all for people's use.
Thank you, Izzy. Kate, this is where I test my order because I've done the intros earlier. Kate, you next.
Yeah, no, definitely. What going on from what Isabel was saying there in terms of, you know, thinking about your own individual actions, because we always say that those small actions do build up collectively to have an impact, and also talking about it within your communities and sharing, you know, that good practice that you're adopting and the reasons why you're adopting it, and finding a little bit more out about the habitats and the species that rely on them, and gives you a better sort of insight on how you can potentially minimize disturbance. So, you know, when birds are nesting, for example, times of year that you may, you know, want to avoid going to certain areas, or you know, keeping your distance, and it's just having that in the back of your mind, and that's why our sort of logos, you know, making the environment second nature, always thinking with everything you're doing, how is this going to impact on the environment, and what can I do as an individual? And the great thing is there's all these organizations here that have information and have that advice, so it's a case of, you know, go and explore, go and find out more, contact us, and you know, we're all here to help. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Kate. And you've prompted something I was going to say later, but it gives you all as panelists a little bit more time. If you have websites or your email contact details, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A section so people can see them to get in touch with you. Molly?
Yeah, so I think I'm sort of echoing a lot of the already been said. You have to be optimistic to work in the environment sector. I think it's going to be made a little bit easier. Definitely habitat restoration and improvements is coming up higher on the agenda, and hopefully the upcoming legislation, which we should be receiving hopefully soon, should make that easier for regulators to be able to enforce habitat improvements as well. Obviously, it's still a challenge with climate change and sea level rise, especially in the estuary where we are constrained by flood defences. But I think one thing I would like to see happen in the sort of habitat restoration thing would be having people more interactive as well. So if you see a seal, reporting it to ZSL or to ourselves, so we are more aware of what's happening on the river and we can then make better decisions. But also things that you can do yourself. You can make some wildflower meadows in your own garden just to help the local wildlife as much as the big scale project as well.
Yeah, yes, we've already actually every little action makes a difference, and that's a really good example of that. Robin?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. So yeah, and I agree, you have to stay optimistic. Well, I think, you know, we're starting from quite a low baseline in some of these areas, aren't we, in terms of the sort of habitat loss over the last 50 years. But yeah, no, I think you've got to be optimistic. I'd go for one sort of PLA type one and one sort of personal one. I think the PLA type one is, I think we have to join up. So, you know, somebody mentioned on the chat the Lawton agenda. You know, there's lots and lots of different sites, and I think we need to take a sort of coherent view of the whole of the Thames Estuary in order to maximise the value of all the different interventions and get the best sort of bang for our buck for nature. And the second would be, which is a personal one, which would be music to the ears of Isabel. I think everybody should make sure they are a member of one of the wildlife conservation, you know, lobbying bodies, because I do know from when I worked in government, they do have a big impact on government policy, and if they didn't exist and didn't bang the table a lot, then we wouldn't have the 25-year plan and the legislation, etc. So I think it's really important that those voices are in the political debate.
Great, thank you, Robin. And so it's left to me with a minute to spare to close today, which is the final event of the Environment Conference. Thank you all for attending. Thank you especially for our panellists, both today and the previous 2 days. If we haven't covered anything in detail today, there are the other recordings will also be made available to you. And if you have any questions which we haven't said we're going to cover off, please send them to the events team and we'll pass them to either the panelists or answer them directly. We hope you've enjoyed the 3 events, and we hope that this is the start of us enjoying a roadmap back to out onto the river and continue the improvements that have been started, as Robin said, over the last couple of decades, and continue to prepare us for a decarbonised economy. Thank you very much for all your time, and we hope to see you in person soon.